History remembers her as a seductress who used her beauty to manipulate the most powerful men in Rome. They say she bathed in milk, that her charm was so irresistible that Julius Caesar and Mark Antony abandoned their empires just to be near her. For 2,000 years, this is the story the world has been told about Cleopatra, the seventh of Egypt. But here's what they don't tell you. Almost everything written about her came from her enemies, the very people who wanted to destroy not just her kingdom, but her legacy, her memory, and the terrifying truth of what she actually represented. Because Cleopatra wasn't just beautiful, she was something far more dangerous to Rome than any army or any rival empire. She was a woman who ruled without apology, who commanded absolute power in her own right, and who nearly reshaped the entire Mediterranean world according to her vision. And Rome couldn't allow history to remember that, so they rewrote her story, turned her into a cautionary tale, a temptress, a footnote to the achievements of men. But the evidence they tried to bury tells a completely different story, one that reveals not just who Cleopatra really was, but why powerful men have spent 2 millennia trying to make sure we never knew. When Cleopatra took the throne of Egypt in 51 BCE at just 18 years old, she inherited a kingdom in crisis. Egypt, once the greatest civilization on earth, had become a shadow of its former glory, a client state of Rome, deeply in debt, politically fractured, and surrounded by enemies who saw it as prey waiting to be devoured. Her father had bankrupted the treasury buying Roman protection. Her siblings plotted against her, and Rome itself was circling like a vulture, waiting for any excuse to annex the wealthiest prize in the Mediterranean. Most historians would have given her months before she was overthrown or murdered. But what those historians didn't know, what Rome itself didn't understand until it was almost too late, was that Cleopatra possessed something far more powerful than beauty or charm. She had an intellect that could match any philosopher in Alexandria, diplomatic skills that would put modern politicians to shame, and a strategic mind that saw opportunities where others saw only disaster. She spoke 9 languages fluently, not as a party trick, but as a tool of statecraft that allowed her to negotiate directly with foreign leaders without interpreters who might betray her words. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years who bothered to learn Egyptian, who understood that power came not just from controlling people, but from winning their genuine loyalty. Ancient sources, even those written by her enemies, grudgingly admit that she was a brilliant scholar, that philosophers traveled from across the world to debate with her, that she wrote treatises on medicine, mathematics, and alchemy that were still being referenced centuries after her death. But here's the detail that should make everyone pause and reconsider everything they think they know. In her own time, among those who actually met her, Cleopatra's beauty was never her defining characteristic. Roman writers who met her in person described her as charismatic and intelligent, but they never called her the most beautiful woman in the world.
Beyond mortal comprehension,
that detail was added later by historians who couldn't accept that a woman might rule through competence rather than seduction, who needed to reduce her power to something they could understand and dismiss. The story of Cleopatra's rise reveals a political genius at work. When her brother and co-ruler Ptolemy XIII forced her from the throne in 48 BCE, she didn't accept defeat. She raised an army, but she knew military force alone wouldn't be enough against her brother's Roman-backed regime. So she orchestrated one of history's most legendary power plays. Julius Caesar had arrived in Egypt pursuing his rival Pompey, and Cleopatra saw her opportunity. The famous story says, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up in a carpet, though ancient sources actually mention a linen sack for carrying bedclothes. But focus on what this moment actually reveals. A 21-year-old woman, exiled and hunted, managed to infiltrate the heavily guarded compound where the most powerful man in the world was staying. And she did it not to assassinate him, but to negotiate. She walked into that room knowing she had one chance to make her case. And by the time she left, she had convinced Caesar to back her claim to the throne over her brothers. Roman historians want you to believe she did this through seduction, but consider the reality. Caesar was 52 years old, had been with countless women, and was famous for his own political brilliance. The idea that he would risk his position, his army, and potentially the stability of Rome itself just because a woman was attractive is insulting to both of them.
As you can see, Julius,
What actually happened is that Cleopatra convinced him that a strong allied Egypt under her rule was worth more to Rome than a weak divided kingdom under her brother. She offered him something no amount of beauty could provide: political stability, economic partnership, and a powerful ally in the East. And she delivered on every promise. With Caesar's support, she reclaimed her throne. And then she did something remarkable. Instead of ruling as Rome's puppet, she began to systematically restore Egypt's power and independence. She reformed the economy, bringing Egyptian currency back to strength. She rebuilt the navy, making Egypt a maritime power again. She negotiated trade agreements that brought wealth flooding back into Alexandria. She positioned herself not as Rome's subordinate, but as the ruler of an independent great power. And she did it so skillfully that Rome couldn't object without admitting they'd been outmaneuvered by a woman. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra found herself alone again, her Roman protector gone, her kingdom vulnerable to whoever would emerge victorious from the chaos of Rome's civil war. Another ruler might have panicked, might have tried to stay neutral and hope for the best, but Cleopatra understood that neutrality was just slow-motion defeat. She studied the players in Rome's power struggle, and she made her choice. Mark Antony, who controlled the eastern provinces and understood the value of eastern allies. Their meeting in 41 BCE has been immortalized in art and literature as a seduction, with Cleopatra arriving on a golden barge dressed as Venus. But look past the spectacle to the strategy beneath. Cleopatra understood theater, understood that power has a performative element. She arrived as an equal, showing her wealth and sophistication, not as a supplicant begging for help. And what she proposed to Antony wasn't a love affair, but a political and military alliance that would reshape the world. Together, they envisioned something that terrified Rome to its core, a genuine partnership between East and West, with Cleopatra's Egypt and Antony's eastern provinces, forming a power block that could rival or even eclipse Rome itself. For nearly a decade, their alliance worked exactly as she had planned. They had children together, yes, but more importantly, they built an empire. Antony's military campaigns in the east were funded by Egyptian gold. Egyptian grain fed his armies. Cleopatra's fleet ruled the eastern Mediterranean. They established a court in Alexandria that became the cultural and political center of the Hellenistic world, a rival to Rome itself. Ancient sources describe ceremonies where Antony declared Cleopatra the queen of kings and distributed territories to their children, creating a dynasty that would rule the eastern Mediterranean for generations. And this is where Rome's propaganda machine went into overdrive, because what Cleopatra and Antony were doing wasn't just politically threatening, it was ideologically dangerous. Rome's entire identity was built on republican values, on the idea that no one person, and certainly no woman, should hold absolute power. But here was Cleopatra, ruling as a divine monarch in the ancient Egyptian tradition, commanding wealth that dwarfed Rome's treasury. And she was pulling one of Rome's greatest generals into her orbit, transforming him from a Roman consul into something that looked disturbingly like an Eastern king. Octavian, who would become Augustus Caesar, understood that he wasn't just fighting a military rival. He was fighting an idea. The idea that a woman could wield power equal to any man, that Eastern monarchy might be superior to Roman republicanism, that Rome's dominance wasn't inevitable or eternal. So Octavian launched a propaganda campaign of staggering sophistication. He declared war not on Antony, his fellow Roman, but on Cleopatra alone, painting her as a foreign sorceress who had enslaved Antony's mind with unnatural powers. Roman poets and historians, working under Octavian's patronage, created the image we know today. Cleopatra, the seductress, the scheming temptress, the dangerous Oriental queen who used sexual manipulation to corrupt virtuous Roman men. They spread stories about her cruelty, her debauchery, her plans to rule Rome from Alexandria. None of it had to be true. It just had to be believable enough to justify what came next. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian's forces defeated the combined fleets of Antony and Cleopatra. The battle itself was close, and military historians still debate what actually happened, but the outcome was decisive. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, and Octavian followed with his army. The next year, as Octavian's forces closed in, Antony received a false report that Cleopatra was dead, and he killed himself. When Cleopatra learned of Antony's death, she knew exactly what awaited her. She would be paraded through Rome in chains, displayed as a defeated barbarian queen in Octavian's triumph, the ultimate humiliation designed to prove that Rome and its men were superior to any woman who dared claim power. So she chose her own ending. The famous story says she died from the bite of an asp, a poisonous snake smuggled to her in a basket of figs. Modern historians debate whether that's literally true or a symbolic story, but the deeper truth is clear. Cleopatra refused to give Octavian his propaganda victory. She died as she had lived, on her own terms, denying her conquerors the satisfaction of breaking her spirit. Cleopatra was not just a figure of beauty or seduction. She was one of history's most capable rulers, whose intelligence and political power threatened Rome. Her story was distorted for 2,000 years, but the truth about her leadership and brilliance continues to emerge. If you want to discover more real stories of women who defied the world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss a thing.